Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to the last, I think, Fire Emblem archetype tier list. I've been saving this one for a while, but I think it's time that we do a Lord tier list, ranking all the Fire Emblem Lords depending on how useful they are, in a somewhat efficient context, since that makes it easier to distinguish them from one another. You can see them on the bottom of the screen here. I left out some characters that some might consider Lords, like Robin, Byleth, Lucina. Might be a little arbitrary, maybe, but there are a lot of characters to go over, and I tried to avoid self-inserts and avatars. Since Fates doesn't really have any Lord other than Corrin, she kind of had to be there, but all the others I left out. And then Lucina, I mean, her starting class is Lord, and she's on the cover of the game, but other than that, I don't think she has a lot in common with the other Lords in here. Lords in general are super interesting to talk about, which is why I've been saving them for so long. First of all, they are almost always on the field at some point in the game, sometimes even for the entire game, so that makes it very easy to get value out of them. Any other units, any other, like, bad or good, you can always replace them with someone else. Like, if you have Wendy and they're really terrible, at least you could just bench them and use something else. But if you have a Lord that's really bad and they're forced to be on the field for one or multiple chapters, getting anything out of them is really good, and then if they're trained, they can be really good for you, depending on who they are. So that's super interesting. Especially when you're playing blindly, like when you're playing a game for the first time, or you haven't played in a long while, it's usually a safe bet to train your Lord, because that way you'll never be stuck with them at a bad point. Fire Emblem games love forcing Lords into like a battle, like especially like late game battles against like a super strong boss enemy, so it's really nice to have a trained Lord for those. Lords strengths vary wildly, not just from game to game, but even within a game. They have these personal weapons, like they usually have a something like a rapier or some other kind of way to deal super effective damage against armored and mounted units, or some other kind of good personal weapon. Sometimes they get legendary weapons, holy weapons, like the Sacred Twins from the Sacred Stones units, or Sigurd's Turfing, or the Falchion, which appears in multiple games, Roy's Binding Blade, the Bragi Blade that Leaf gets late in the game. A big thing with Lords is their promotion times. They're usually very late in the game, they're usually forced. Most units you can promote with something like a Master Seal or promotion item, or just getting them to the right level, and you can promote them in some way. But Lords, they usually have to wait, and that usually sucks, because I don't know if they think that units should promote that late, or if they just wanted to make Lords promote later than others, but the result is usually that, like, for 3/4 of the game, or even like all but one chapter of the game, Lords tend to be held back from promoting, and that can really suck. And either they're stuck at like fighting at their level cap, or they're just not very good compared to other units, and that can be really annoying. A lot of Lords suffer from this, but you know, there's a lot of things that make up for that. So let's see how good they are exactly. I can tell you right now, they vary wildly. I made a list ahead of time to give myself an idea of like where I put them all. So let's go over them and you know, see where they end up. So today we're going to be doing Marth. I have, I think, 3-4 variations of Marth that are going to end up in like roughly different places. I have Alm, both his Guided version and the remake version, Shadows of Valentia, same for Celica. From Genealogy, I have Sigurd and Seliph. Thracia, I got Leaf. Roy in the Binding Blade. And then from the Blazing Blade, I have Hector, Lyn, and Eliwood. Yes, Lyn is actually from the Blazing Blade, believe it or not. Eirika and Ephraim are from Sacred Stones, and then Ike from Radiant Dawn and Path of Radiance, not respectively. Micaiah from Radiant Dawn, and then Marth from the remakes, like I already said. Chrom from Awakening, Corrin from Fate, and then the Three Houses Lords, Eliwood, Dimitri, and Claude. Now, Marth from FE1, probably the least played Lord, because a lot of people haven't played Shadow Dragon, although that might have changed when they released a port of it on the Switch. Marth is interesting. I think the coolest thing about Marth is what I like to call his taunt, or his auto-provoke ability, kind of like a passive ability, where enemies love attacking Marth because they kind of know that they cause a game over if they die, whereas if anyone else dies, you probably won't even reset for it because it's FE1. Like, that's kind of how the game was designed. But when Marth dies, it's a game over, so they'll just go for him all the time. Even if there's a kill available, whereas they wouldn't be able to kill Marth, perhaps, like a frail cleric like Lena or something, they'll just go for Marth almost every time. I think I've had one occasion where they didn't, but usually that's the way it goes. And that can be really exploitable. In an efficient setting, I don't think it's very important, but in an efficient setting, something else is going on in favor of Marth, which is that the game plays as fast as Marth can get to the throne or the gate, and as a result, it's in your best interest to make Marth as strong as humanly possible. If you want his very broken stat boosters, and Marth himself has pretty good stats overall, especially growth-wise. So with some assistance from like Jagan, Minerva, it's usually the best way to play that game in a low turn count setting is to just bum rush Marth through everything and make him as strong as possible. I don't know if it's fair to count all that into Marth's favor, because it's less that Marth himself is a really good target for resources, that he's like really good at the game, and it's less, if you don't do this, he's a huge liability, so you're kind of forced to do it. It's kind of a similar problem with Seliph, actually, that we'll get into later. I still think Marth is S tier, and everyone I've talked to kind of agrees, but I'm not sure if I entirely buy the logic, but at the same time, he is really good. One thing I do want to mention about Marth, it's a personal pet peeve. A lot of people praise the FE1 Falchion as being like another reason why Marth is so good, which... it's a really good weapon, don't get me wrong. It's like a personal silver sword for him that he can use as an elixir, and it seals all attacks from enemies that are not ranged, not Manichees. The problem with that is, though, that a lot of the enemies that Marth fights, by the time you get the Falchion, which, by the way, is one chapter before the end of the game, like one chapter before endgame, so like literally 2 chapters. And then when you get there, chapter 24, the penultimate map, it's all snipers, Manichees, and bishops, so all enemies that don't care about Falchion seal effect. And then sure, you can use his item as an infinite use elixir, but you can also just heal Marth with another healer and then use his turn to stab an enemy in the face with the Falchion, which I think is a better use of his time. So I generally don't really find this ability very useful. I would still heavily recommend using Marth in FE1 though, because he's the easiest solution to fighting the final boss, Medius. All the other solutions are available. I'm not going to get into specifics like what works and what doesn't, because I'm not entirely sure what works and what doesn't right now. I could be bothered to look up the FE1 mechanics exactly, but I do know a lot of people maybe didn't get soft locked, but they had a lot of trouble with Medius because they didn't train their Marth. So I would heavily recommend using him. He is good in his own right, and honestly, the fastest way to go through FE1 period is to just use Marth a lot. So he's good, but you do got to invest into him. Next up is FE3 Marth. This is his Book 2 portrait. And FE3, I mean, it's half a remake of Book 1, or half a remake of FE1, I always get this wrong, and half a sequel. And this is a game I haven't played a whole lot, but I think the Marth in these games is both okay. For similar reasons, the fastest way to play this game is to have Marth run from village to village and then run to the throne. So you probably want him to be as good as possible. Some things from FE1 were a bit nerfed in that regard. He doesn't have the auto-provoke anymore, but other than that, he's still really powerful. I do think something I haven't mentioned yet for FE1 Marth that I might as well bring up here is the fact that Marth has to get all the villages in a map if you want them all at all. It's hard to really quantify that for a tier list to decide, you know, is this a boon or a bane? Because on one hand, he gets all these recruitable characters and all these items you can obtain for you. So in a way that's like, you should credit him like you credit a thief for it. But at the same time, he's force deployed, so you don't really have the choice to undeploy Marth and not do it. And he doesn't really have to be used in combat for it. So do you really give him credit for it? And the other side of that coin is that if you are taking Marth from a village to another village, then his trajectory of where he can go on a map is very limited. He can't always be fighting an enemy or even be in enemy range. He can't always get combat XP if he's busy visiting villages. Someone like, I don't know, Cain or Abel or Minerva, they can go wherever they want on the map to do something that's useful to you, whereas Marth is very limited in where he can go, because, you know, getting through the map with him is a step-by-step progress, unless you're slowing down way to make sure that Marth can, like, maybe go to left first and then go right after. It's going to be kind of awkward with him, so that's a bit of a limit that I've never really been able to quantify for tier list properly, but it is something that you should weigh in if you're trying to tier Marth. Thankfully, tier lists are not a very serious process, at least not for me, so I encourage you not to take it seriously yourself, but that is something I'd have to deal with. I think FE3 Marth is like worse than FE1 Marth, but not so much that I put him a tier lower. He's still really powerful, but again, not without investment. You do really got to use him, and again, I think you'll make your Medius fight a lot less painful if you do use Marth in these games. Now, I could discuss Marth again here, but I think it's okay to take a break from him real quick and head into some Alm and some Celica. Alm is a really interesting unit in both Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia. Not super different, roughly they perform the same. Alm is available for Acts 1, 3, and then 4, and basically 5. I don't think they call it Act 5 in Gaiden, but it is the part where you go into the tower, the final Duma Palace Temple. There we go, that's the word I was looking for, temple. And Alm is really good in Act 1. He's almost like a Jagan. He has stats better than most of your army, and he hits really hard, and he's really good there. Act 3, he isn't too good. he's actually usually worse than the other units. This is especially true for Echoes, where other units get a lot more advantages over him. And then he becomes really, really good again with his promotion for Act 4 and the final part of the game in both of these games. Now, not being very good in Act 3, I think does hurt Alm's performance overall. But the great thing about Alm is that you don't have to use him in Act 3. You can leave him on the sidelines. You can't bench him, but you can leave him on the sidelines and you don't really lose a lot from it, because Alm doesn't need experience to become good. His promotion will set him to his class basis. He promotes from fighter to hero. A bit strange because he uses swords and then swords bows, but that's what the classes are called. So he promotes to hero and then he gets the hero basis no matter what. So whether you've used Alm all day long or whether you just used him for a little bit, he will promote to the hero bases, which are really good. And unless you train Alm to like level 20 or something, like I think like level 17 is what it takes to beat his hero averages, he's not going to be any better for it. So in a way, investing to him is a huge waste of experience. Now, I think that's a boon for Alm. I don't think it hurts him at all, because that means you get more XP to give to your other units and help them promote too, because especially in Gaiden and Echoes, gaining levels is a huge deal for reaching promotion benchmarks. The way promotion works in that game is someone like, I don't know, Python, who is an archer who can promote to sniper. If he reaches level 7, he can promote to sniper. If he's level 6 instead, he can't promote. So you need to get to level 7 by a certain point to make sure he can promote at a convenient time. So XP is pretty valuable, and Alm lets your other units have more of it, which I think is pretty good. That does mean that in practice he spends a lot of time on the sidelines. Act 3 is a pretty long portion of the game, but he's still helping your army in another way. That's pretty neat. There's a couple interesting differences between Gaiden Alm and Echoes Alm. One big difference I can name is that bows in FE2 have 1 to 5 range, and so Alm has access to 1 to 5 range bows. Pretty powerful. In Echoes, bows have 1 to 3 range, and then certain classes have range +1 and range +2 as like innate skills, and Alm's class hero doesn't have those skills. What that means is that Alm will usually be outranged by enemy bow users like snipers and bow knights, and as a result he can't counterattack them most of the time. And so Alm is actually pretty subpar at using bows in those kind of instances. He's still pretty good at using them against like arcanists and stuff, or on player phase, like using Hunter's Volley for example with the killer bow is just absolutely fantastic for him. But he loses a lot of options that we have in Gaiden. So in Gaiden, I think he's relatively better off. I think I had him in 8 tier. I'm going to double check that real quick because I did have this pre-made somewhere. Yeah, so I had him in 8 tier for that, because I don't think he's as essential as Marth is. I think there's plenty of characters better than him for a significant portion of the game. But I do think he's really good, and I think you should use him whenever it's convenient. For Act 1, I like to treat him as a bit like you would treat FE6 Marcus. Use him to kill stuff when you need to, or weaken things for others when you don't need to, and he'll be pretty good then, even if he doesn't get a whole lot of XP. A lot of people will insist that you should use Alm like full time, give him like XP whenever, like give him just as much XP as possible. I don't think that's the great way to answer. Like, put it another way. Some people think you should feed him equal amounts of XP as you would treat another unit, but I think it's a waste. But I still think that helps Alm because he helps other units get more XP. So yeah, I think Gaiden Alm is a little bit better. As like a compensation though, Alm in SOV does have access to the convoy, and he helps other characters get like food out whenever they want to heal or something like that, or like maybe do some tricks with like swapping their items around. That can be nice. It's like a very little thing though. It does not make up for having 1 to 5 range late in the game with a bow, for instance. I also just think SOV Alm is relative to other units. I don't think he got buffed as much by SOV. I think in a way he got nerfed because of the bow thing. Whereas a lot of other units just got like better growth, better bases, better stats all around, better spell lists sometimes, depending on who you're talking about. So in that way, I think Alm, relatively speaking, compared to other characters, is worse off in SOV compared to Gaiden, but not by a whole lot. Then there's Celica. I actually had to ask around for Celica because I wasn't really sure how good she was in that game. I haven't played Gaiden in a little while. I have used her recently in SOV, but I just wanted to make sure like what are the major differences between Gaiden and SOV Celica. So shout out to Karma, and I think I asked Rengor and Peeved as well for their opinions. The general consensus, I think, or at least what Karma told me, is that Celica is more appreciated in Gaiden. Sometimes for having higher accuracy than most characters, like having to hit like high avoid gargoyles with Seraphim magic is very nice. But mostly I feel like they play the same from what I remember. I liked SOV Celica a lot. She plays similar to May and Bowie in a lot of aspects, so if you've used those, you probably have a rough idea of how Celica plays if you invest heavily into her. What I mean by heavily investing, by the way, is the best way to use characters in a lot of Fire Emblem games, and this includes Celica's route Act 2 and onwards, is focusing your XP in a small number of units. And Celica can be one of those units that's really, really strong by getting like all the fountains that boost your stats, all the experience, which means a lot of level ups, and then reaching spell lists early. That really helps you snowball and just crush the whole game and stuff. Celica in that respect is kind of cool. May and Bowie have a problem where they lose a lot of HP when they attack because every spell you cast in SOV and in Gaiden as well costs you HP. And Celica has that as well, but she counters an enemy phase using a sword, which can be a drawback if you do less damage with it, sure. But it also doesn't cost you HP whenever you use it, so in a way you have a durability boost over them. The Blessed Sword is pretty good, sometimes for just reaching 2-hit kill thresholds and giving you passive healing, but you also don't cost HP. You don't lose HP whenever you attack with it, so that can be nice. When I played, I did miss the 2-hit kill threshold on quite a few enemies actually when using Celica. That might have been poor luck on my part, or it might have been that I should have like a playthrough that efficiently invested Celica to so more, or maybe rig slightly better levels for her to get the lowest turn count possible. But either way, I was pretty satisfied with Celica. One funny thing that comes up with Celica in especially SOV is that lords can usually not change their deployment slot. It sounds like a very minor drawback, and it is for most players. Like, most casual players won't really care about this, but these are kind of games where everyone starts with about 4 move and it doesn't change a whole lot. Think like 3 houses if you haven't played these games. But then one of your units starts always in the center of your army, or like in the back even. And everyone usually moves their full move towards the enemy army. And when that happens, that initial deployment slot looks kind of annoying. It's like, why can't you be closer to the enemy? For me, it was extra frustrating because Celica was one of my only really good units for early Act 2. And as I slowly got more and more, it mattered less and less. But I just kept thinking, like, if I'd been using May or Bowie instead, they would have been closer to the action, like 1 turn earlier every single time. And that 1 turn, for an efficient playthrough, that adds up over time, right? For a casual playthrough, you won't really care all that much. But I thought Celica was alright. I don't think she was great, but I thought she was alright. I think I had her in like B, maybe even C. Yeah, kind of like a higher B tier. I'm going to give SOV Celica the benefit of the doubt that she's a little bit better overall. Although SOV Celica, I don't know, I think relatively off actually, Gaiden Celica is a little bit better, but again, not a big difference between them all. For the last SOV tier list I did, I had Celica and Alm in the same tier, which I could also see. It kind of depends on your perspective. This one is a little less efficiency skewed, I guess. I don't know, you could argue that they're both in A, honestly. But this is where roughly I would put them. I think Celica's pretty good. One more thing I want to say about Celica, especially SOV Celica, is that her late game stats are ridiculously bonkers, and she does a lot of damage in 1 hit. For instance, she's very, very strong at killing Jeddah when he has a Draco Shield in the Act 4 swamp maps. She only needs, like, for me, she needs a crit and a hit. I think you can rig it so she literally only needs to crit him to 1 KO him, which can be very satisfying. Like, even if you're not caring about, like, getting lowest turn count, it's just fun to kill Jeddah on that map. And just in general, she does a ton of damage. She has some healing utility as well. And just like Alm, in Gaiden, there's less competition for Celica, and like when it comes to being good, like other units are a lot worse in Gaiden than they are, whereas she gained less in SOV. So relatively speaking, I think Gaiden Celica is better off. You have better options in SOV than Celica for the most part. Like Leon, for instance, is a lot better in SOV. So relatively speaking, I think the original versions are a little bit better, but don't underestimate SOV Celicas. He's actually pretty good. Next up are the FE4 Lords, the Genealogy of the Holy War people. Sigurd and Seliph, and I like them both a lot, and I don't think that's a secret at all. Sigurd is pretty straightforward. If you haven't played this game, imagine you get Seth, but he's your lord. That's how I would summarize Sigurd. I went into detail, really like in great detail, on my Fire Emblem best 15 characters ever tier list thing. Not even a tier list, just the 15 best characters ever. And it was not quite at the top, but he was like top 3 basically. He's that good. He's just insanely powerful. He starts off being able to one-round enemies, and then in the same chapter he gets a silver sword that only he can use, other units cannot. And then FE4 has this really big incentive to snowball a single unit or a single weapon, because you can basically train weapons in that game. And Sigurd happens to be the best at taking advantage of that for several reasons. First off, the inventory system in FE4 just greatly favors him. Enemies drop weapons sometimes, especially bosses. Sigurd is the best boss killer, and he's also someone who has to get in every castle to seize it. which happens to be where these bosses are located. So every time a boss drops a powerful weapon, chances are Sigurd will probably obtain it and use it to his own advantage. So he's the best person in a lot of different ways to get these items, and as a result, it's easier to keep them on them rather than trade them to someone else who would use them in a worse capacity anyway. Because like I said, focusing your resources into like a single unit is the best way to thrive as a Fire Emblem unit, and Sigurd does that better than anyone else. So he can build up kills on a silver sword. The reason this works well is because it only has 50 uses, but you can repair it in every base that you enter. And every time you kill something, the silver sword gets +1, let's call it a star rating, whatever. And then once that rating hits 50, the sword automatically gains the ability to critical. Normally you can't critical on FE4 unless you have an ability to do so. But Sigurd, through just critting a lot of things with a single weapon, will just do that. So he can build up kills on like a silver sword or a brave sword, which by the way is a really ridiculous weapon that he can use, or even the light brand, which gives him 1 to range, and just kind of snowball out of control and just beat the whole game like that. I could go into detail like just how bulky he is, or how he has like one more move than most of your units for like half the game, and then he still ties them for the other half of the game. How there are no flyers that would outcompete, outmaneuver Sigurd, but you get the point, and either way I just did so. Sigurd is really strong. The more interesting unit to analyze in FE4 in Genealogy, in my opinion, is Seliph, because he's the son of Sigurd, so he will inherit Sigurd's inventory. And it's really tough to weigh that in a tier list context, because Seliph does not start out as ridiculous as Sigurd. It's kind of hard to draw an analogy to someone else when it comes to Seliph at base. But think of him as starting out as like, I don't know, roughly like as strong as Alm is, I guess, in Shadows of Valentia, or like as strong as Marth maybe, but he promotes into Seth. Once he promotes, he's basically Seth. Now the most efficient way to do this, especially when it comes to the unit that you would, need to get to places, need to get to castles, to seize them, to beat the maps as soon as possible. The best way to do that would be to train him is to have that horseback to become Seth as soon as possible. So the most efficient playthroughs, they give Seliph all the resources he needs, including a band that give him Paragon from the start. Like they just have Sigurd pass it down to him, and then he takes like 1 chapter to train. He like vacuums all the XP, all the resources in that map, and he becomes really good. If you don't do this, you slow down a little bit, you promote him later, he's still good, but I think he'd be close to like A tier or maybe like lower S tier. But the way an efficient playthrough dictates this process, he has to be that good. So it's kind of like the same thing with Marth. It's not that Seliph himself is that great, although his stats are really good. Like his growths are out of control good, and his bases are sufficient to like one-on KO with the right weapon right from the start. But he's not as ridiculous as Sigurd, but he becomes so in the context that we're talking about. So with these standards, he kind of has to be in the S tier, but it's a bit an awkward S tier. I think I put him in the top 15 as best units as well, but it was a bit more of an awkward fit because it's like, he's really good because he's the best candidate for these resources. If you distribute these resources elsewhere, let's say you make not Seliph, but like Larsa your carry unit like that, you give her all that XP, she also becomes really good. Not quite as good, she doesn't get a horse, she doesn't have as much movement, and her stats are still sufficient to do everything he does combat-wise. Although she wouldn't be able to use lances, but that's not a really big deal. She wouldn't get the turfing like Seliph does, I guess. That's something, but turfing's not that important in efficient playthroughs anyway. And then she becomes almost as good, but she still can't seize, so you would still need to have Seliph run behind her to seize all his castles. That would still be infinitely worse than just using Seliph instead. So it's awkward. But I still think in the end, it's worth an S tier. I think some people would put FE1 Marth over Seliph here, but I disagree. I think FE1 Marth is carried almost only by a circumstance I just talked about, where Seliph in his own right has really solid stats and is just really powerful. And honestly, the inheritance also just never lets him go through like a bad period. FE1 Marth starts out passable, but not super great. You would almost rather fight with Jagan or even one of your multi units sometimes, depending on the circumstances. Whereas Seliph, I mean, no one else is better than him besides like Oifi when he starts out. And Oifi joins like 3 turns later, which is when Seliph is already like knee deep into enemy territory. So even Oifi falls behind on Seliph in chapter 6. So he really is the best unit for the whole playthrough, basically, or for like the half playthrough that he exists in. Then we have Leaf, one of my favorites because, I love Thracia. I made a waifu video on Leaf, so if you're interested in like a super in-depth analysis on him, I'd recommend you check that out. But I'm a little bit down on Leaf compared to how I am in that video right now, because a lot of the things I listed in that video as being super big advantages for him, I'm not so sure about anymore. And I kind of mentioned that in the video itself, but I've been having that thought more and more. This is a little bit compounded by my current FE5 playthrough, which is on negative growth, where he never gets stronger, he just gets weaker, so that might not have helped either. But here's the breakdown on Leaf, right? So the great thing about Leaf there's two things that I can't take away from him that I think are really good. The one of them is his high availability. He is around for every single chapter in the game. No other Thracia unit can match that. Some other units have to sit out chapters due to fatigue or not being very good for a map, but Leaf is always going to be there, and the Leaf is always going to be helpful to some extent. Some maps he doesn't do that much in, but everything he does is still a solid contribution. He really is helped by what I mentioned at the beginning, where he is forced into every battle, so you might as well make use of him. Everything he does is a positive. The other thing that he does is the Light Brand. It's his personal weapon in this game. It has 60 uses, it has 1 or 2 range, it does magical damage at range, it gives him a lot of flexibility. Good 1-2 range combat. It's not rare in Thracia, but it's a very nice boon if you do have it, and some other units can have it with some resources. And Leaf too needs some resources to get good with it. Like without the speed ring, for example, that gives him +3 speed, he's probably not going to double anything, but he's by far the best candidate for it. I can't really think of any unit that would use it significantly better than he does. So I would still give it to him. You could argue like maybe Dakdar, maybe, but even he doesn't really need it. So I generally like giving that to Leaf, and then I usually play the game with that in mind. The problems with Leaf are general Lord problems, such as not being able to promote early. The starting position doesn't really matter that much. It's really just a promotion that he can't do. He can't like become a Master Knight like he can in FE4. He's just kind of stuck as a Leaf Lord. And even when he does promote, he's not all that strong. He just gets like +1 in every stat, and he turns his sprite around in the promotion animation, basically. He still only uses swords for the entire game, which is not terrible, but it's like, kind of wish for more flexibility sometimes, right? Like if he uses magic, that'd be pretty cool, but he can't, and that's unfortunate. But I find it hard to really justify Leaf's high ranking that I usually give him in Thracia, because everything else he has to his name, it's there. You can make a long list of it. You can be like, okay, movement star plus leadership stars plus adept is Punich Incarnate, and it's like, those things are nice individually, sort of, but not really. They're not even that good. Like the movement star, you generally don't play around getting a 5% chance of moving again. You'll move as if you don't get it, and then, or maybe if you're super desperate, you'll try for it, you probably won't get it 95% of the time. And then when you do get it, often you'll have factored in that you won't get it, and so it won't be all that beneficial. It can definitely help. Sometimes you can try for it without any like drawbacks if you don't get it, and it will be beneficial, but those are more rare than anything, and it's still only 5%. And then Adept is like, it's like 5% when he's like early game, and he's like weighed down by every weapon, so it doesn't activate very much, and just like the movement star, you can't really rely on it. Later on, when he gets like more speed, maybe you can rely on it a little bit more. You can be like, okay, I'm two-shotting this enemy, but if I get an add proc, he's dead. Or like an add proc for movement star and he's dead. That can be okay, but it's not very big. Leadership stars, I mean, Leaf is forced on the field, so it's almost the same thing as like a tactician bonus, like you get an FE7. Do you really credit units that give you leadership star if they're force fielded? For someone like Glade, for example, or Finn, if you don't field them, you don't get their benefit. But for Leaf, he's forced to be on the field, so that bonus is always going to be there. You don't have the option of benching him to not get it. So I find it really hard to attribute that bonus to Leaf. I think it's a good bonus. I think 3 to 6% hit and avoid, which is what it gives to other units, is a pretty big deal. But I can't really ascribe it to Leaf, because I literally could just move Leaf. I could just keep Leaf on the starting position and never move him at all. Like, never do anything with Leaf at all. Like, just completely forget he exists and would still get it. Which sounds really good. It's like, okay, I don't need to have to put him in harm's way. But I'm not making a choice to use Leaf. I just play the game and I get that bonus. So that's why I say it's like the tactician bonus. So I don't really think it's fair to give him credit for that. And then Leaf just kind of gets outclassed by every other unit that can promote for like half the game. The one thing he does have to his name at that point is supports. Now, I went over the support list in my waifu video, and I think about like disqualified half of them as not very useful, generally speaking. Some of them are like situationally useful. Like he supports like good units, like Safi, for example, but she doesn't really need combat bonus now, does she? She just needs to warp people. There are circumstances where you can make use of it, like in Lolo's playthrough that I linked a while ago in my community tab. But, you know, that's not really very common, is it? And then I think sometimes you make use of the supports, like Aspel and Nana and Finn. They make great use of that support. I'm not going to deny that. So those are really good. Then you have Dalston, who can make use of it, like Ronan can make use of it sometimes in like weird circumstances, but that's not super common. I think Dalston is like fairly common. Like, you make use of that in Master. Ronan, I don't think I care too much about that. So even those are like okay, but is it worth putting him very high? So I think I put Leaf in like around B to C tier in the end. That's where I roughly end up with him. End up talking to Leaf like longer than I thought. I have him on A here, which I guess is fine too. Like lower end of A maybe. I don't know. It's really hard to weight Leaf, I think. It's a really complicated, really interesting unit. Next up, we have Roy from the Binding Blade. And I gotta say a couple things about Roy, mostly related to casual play first, because I just finished an FE6 casual playthrough with a couple of changes, but nothing was really changed with regards to Roy. I was surprised at how useful Roy was for his supports in a setting where I wasn't support grinding. I thought his supports were surprisingly good. Just helping Alan and Lance, and potentially even Shanna if you want to go that way, but mostly those two, because it's a fast support. Getting bonuses was actually pretty easy when you're playing FE6 the way that I think most people play it, which is not grinding, but just going at the pace that the map kind of allows you to in a hard mode where you're trying to be careful. That let him get supports with anyone I wanted him to have supports with pretty fast. I also supported him with Alina, for example. Up to B support, but still was pretty fast. That said, in this kind of context, these supports don't really do anything, and that's where we get to Roy's more well-known traits, shall we say. So, for example, the fact that he doesn't promote until before chapter 22, which is one chapter before the end of the game, or like 3 chapters if you're playing the true ending, which most people do. So about 7/8 of the game, he is unpromoted, unfortunately. And then in addition, he has very mediocre stats, like actual bad bases and okay growth. So for the most of the game, he'll have pretty bad stats. And then all the problems that go along with it, like being 5 move and sword locked, that's kind of on par with a lot of other units, like Rutger is like that for a couple maps. It's not a big problem for him. But because Roy would have liked to have a good ranged sword, the only one he gets is the light brand, so that kind of sucks. But at the same time, I don't think he would be much better off with a javelin or a hand axe. So honestly, I can't even blame him for being sword locked. I just don't think. I think his low con doesn't help because his speed is not even enough to double normally. And then the fact that he has I think it's like 5 or 6 con means that if he ever uses steel sword, he just gets doubled. So in that way, he's really not very flexible in weapons. So when I say sword locked, I don't mean it's bad that sword is the weapon type he chose. It's just it doesn't really offer many options. I guess one good thing is that killing edges are buyable, so you can be okay with those. But if you're only doing okay with killing edges, it doesn't really show a lot of good prospects for your combat, because that's his best weapon outside of rapiers against cavaliers. That can be pretty handy actually, rapier against cavaliers. I wish it was effective against nomads, but against cavaliers it's still somewhat useful. But it doesn't really get him very far. Like I said, in chapter 4, maybe chapter 7, some of them, sometimes in chapter 3, I guess. But other than that, it's not even strong enough to one-round KO them ever. Not even two-shot them a lot of the time. So you get two-shot early game, but not late in the game. So that doesn't really help. But he does get really good for the last couple chapters when he promotes against the Binding Blade. He's actually really powerful at that point, which is what most people know him for. That's his sole smash reputation right there. That's when he becomes really useful. And he's actually a really good candidate for getting late game boots, because it'll help him get to seize points faster. It means he no longer has to be carried around anywhere. And, his combat is actually quite passable. I still found that even after promotion, he had trouble doubling faster enemies, or mid-speed enemies even. I think he sometimes doesn't even double the snipers in chapter 22, for instance, which is the ultimate mid-speed enemy range. But he definitely doesn't double mercenaries unless they're being weighed down. He does double Manicheets, thankfully. I think he's your best character against enemy Manicheets, because he doesn't take a counterattack and he has one to range, and he'll probably outmove them by a lot because he's such a good boots investment. So in that way, Roy is still okay. I don't know if I can really put him very low. I need to peek real quick where I put him last time. Yeah, I'm gonna have to put him around C, because even though I think he's one of the worst characters out of all the lords and one of the more middling characters in FE6, the utility he provides is still free. So I can't really put him below, I can't really justify putting him lower than C right now. He could be a candidate for D though, if you really want to argue that way, for an efficiency playthrough. Honestly, he could be. But I think you can probably find something for Roy to do in most chapters, even if it's only 1 or 2 times. Even if it's just if he's just in the saddlebags, then yeah, he's not doing anything. But sometimes there's something for him to do, like weaken an enemy or counter with a rapier or something at the very least that will make him passable. But I will admit, he's not very good. Next up are the lords from Fire Emblem 7, so Hector, Lyn, and Eliwood. Hector, I think, is really cool because he's one of those lords that, even though he promotes really late, he's still fairly good at contributing throughout most of his unpromoted lifetime. He has a very good start, unlike a lot of these lords. Like, for example, Roy, pretty bad start. Leaf, pretty bad start. Like, for example, even Seliph, he starts pretty good if you give him those resources, but if you don't, he's just good, but not great. Hector is really one of your better units when you have him. He's not as good as Marcus. I would say he's worse than Oswin. But other than that, who's really better than him? I guess Lowen has more move, but Hector's pretty damn good, especially in casual play. Where you get in more efficient contexts, often Hector is forced to be dragged along to a seize point, and as a result he can't contribute as much. But even like in Donna's 0% growth playthrough, where Hector obviously doesn't have as many levels as he should, he would still find ways to make use of Hector, even in combat sometimes, despite the fact that he's at base stats, which I found was like very funny at the very least. He's obviously very bulky, both in the sense that it's sometimes a little hard to carry him around, but also in the sense that he's just very durable. He's not as durable as Oswin is, for example, but he's very, very tough defensively, especially when he's got a couple levels on his belt, which is very good. He uses axes, which really favors him in the game with a lot of lances as enemies, so that's a free extra bonus to his hit, his avoid, his defense, his offense, etc. So that's all very nice, and it also really helps with the personal weapon, the Wolf Beal, which does effective damage, and you know, effective damage works better when you have weapon triangle advantage, and when you have more might on that weapon, and the Wolf Beal, I think it's the strongest personal weapon in the game. I mean, obviously the legendary ones are stronger that you get at the end, but those don't really count, right? So, all that makes Hector pretty unique. I think it's one of the reasons he's so beloved, besides the fact that his personality is just a little different than most lords. He's just a strong guy. He's easy to use for newer players. Like, units with high defense and reasonable offense as well are just very easy to use, and as a result, they're pretty big fan favorites. Let me check where I had him originally, because in efficient playthroughs, obviously he does fall off. He only has like 5 move for a lot of the game. He doesn't get promotion bonuses, so he still suffers from a lot of the same problems as the lords. But I think he suffers a bit less, and as a result, you usually give him higher ratings. Let me see. My original rating had like the top of C, which seems strange right now because Roy is right there. And in fact, I could argue him up to B, I think. Like, for example, I think Donna's rating thing that he did a while ago on his first time like a 7 out of 10. Whereas Roy, I think, is close to like a 5 or 6 out of 10. So again, I think this may be a case for Roy moving down later, but we'll save that until we have more lords on the roster. Next we have Lyn. I've done very elaborate analysis on Lyn on this channel. In fact, I'm about to do another one about Lyn in the Binding Blade. But of course, if you see my Let's Play of that, you know that part. Lyn she suffers from everything that makes lords bad in like, and then squared, because you know she uses swords, so no one-to range, weapon triangle against lances, and these problems apply to Eliwood as well, by the way. So this makes her personal weapon worse as well. Her speed is overkill for most enemy types, and then for the enemies that you actually want to double, it's not good enough, like mercenaries, Valkyries, etc. And so she hits those speed she hits the speed benchmarks that most people have no trouble hitting, and then she doesn't meet the speed benchmarks that are like actually hard to hit, and where a faster user would actually be in demand. So kind of the worst of both worlds, really, because speed is really her main selling point, and everything else is pretty crappy, like especially durability. I think she has the worst durability in the game when you factor in something like access to one to range. And then she also has late promotion. She doesn't promote as late as Hector does, no matter what story you're playing, but I'm assuming Hector hard mode for this. But even in Eliwood mode, she doesn't get a Heaven Seal until the Violet chapter. And that's the first one you get, and that's later than most promotion items. And then even when you do get it, if you're also using Eliwood, they have to compete over that promotion item, so they're actively making each other worse as well. And all this, even a promotion doesn't really solve her main problem, which is still being locked to swords, but at least it solves the durability issue for the most part, because she gets a lot of bulk from promoting, and also she gets the ability to avoid counters using a bow. Bows aren't great in FE7, but when you have swords and bows, you can usually kind of make do. The combo works better in FE6, where both weapon types are much better compared to the enemy types you face, but it's still, she's no longer locked to swords. Like, she has options, and the options increase her amount of options that she has, if that makes any sense. She's better off, but she would still prefer to have lances or axes. Eliwood, contrary on Lyn, does get lances upon promotion. He also gets a mount, so he is much better off. However, Lyn is much better as a flunky than Eliwood, because if you don't really train them, you're just using them when they're free to deploy, which is a couple times. They're not forced to deploy as often as Hector is in Hector hard mode, but you're still forced to deploy sometimes. And in those situations, I find it easier to use Lyn, especially early on, because she's faster, so she can sometimes double something. And the Marikati is stronger than a Rapier. And when you're using units as a flunky, like you're only using them a little bit, the fact that their personal weapons have limited uses doesn't really matter. Like they're never going to break their weapons if you're only using them occasionally. So the Marikati is much stronger than the Rapier, and as a result, you know, Lyn kind of edges out on strength on Eliwood, even with a couple of levels. But even their strength aren't even that very part. I think Lyn has one less base at level 1 compared to Eliwood, and then his growth is like maybe 5% higher. So if you're not training them full time, I think Lyn is slightly better, like slightly. I think if you do train them both, then Eliwood edges out. He has a couple small advantages on top of the promotion, like having a quick C support with Hector that takes like 2 turns to build, maybe 3. So stuff like that makes him better in the long run. So for the sake of the tier list, I guess I'll assume they're being used in the long run. I'll put Eliwood over Lyn, but I do think these are solid D tiers. Now, if you look at this right now, it does look more apparent that Eliwood, that Roy maybe fits better in D tier, but we'll hold on for a little bit. Like when I can think of Roy, I can't really think of a better reason to put him in C besides like this couple chapters where he has the Rapier with triple effectiveness, and that's kind of about it. And I guess the end game, he does have a better end game than Eliwood and Lyn, but only by a little bit. Rather, it's a big difference, but he's only good for like 2 chapters, 3 chapters maybe, and a lot of that turns is he's going to be spent seizing. So is he really that great in those chapters? I don't know. We'll see what Eirika and Ephraim end up being, right? So Eirika, I like to think of her as like Lyn plus. Like she's Lyn, but with a lot of things that are just a bit improved. For one, FE8 is triple effectiveness, so the Rapier is much better. Eirika can actually one-round enemy brigands, or fighters at least, not brigands. Brigands are a bit bulkier, but fighters she can one-round with like 1 strength level up, or if they roll down on HP or defense, she can generally one-round them early on. It's pretty good. She does fall off quickly because just like most of the other lords, she does really suffer from a late promotion. And just like Lyn, she has strength issues. Her speed, I don't think it really helps her much more than the high speed helps Lyn. Most FE8 units can double most enemies. There are some tougher speed benchmarks to hit occasionally, like FE8 has more enemy rangers that you actually have to fight, for instance, like in the Desert chapter. Couple of enemy heroes you might have to spar with, maybe some swordmasters somewhere. A lot of them you can skip late game thanks to, you know, faster strategies with warp, but I find that they're a bit more common, I guess. What does Eirika have to offer than that? Not a whole lot. FE8, generally most units get power crept, so even if you compare it to Lyn, she compares favorably. Everyone else is better too, like for example Seth is better than Marcus, Franz is better than Lowen, Garcia is better than Dorcas. Like all the equivalents, they're just stronger. So being slightly better than Lyn doesn't really mean that Eirika ends up being a better unit overall. A promotion, I think, overall, I would prefer to be an Eirika situation where at least your promotion doesn't come at the cost of someone else promoting late. She just gets a free promotion, but it still comes really late at the end of chapter 16, the Orson chapter. She does get a really good personal weapon, unlike Lyn. Like the Soul Kadi is pretty trash. I didn't even mention it earlier, but the Sieglinde is insanely strong. I think it gets +5 strength. It does weigh her down a bit, but she can one-shot pretty much any monster type. I think an untrained Eirika might not one-shot every monster type. Like she might not one-shot Gorgons, which is something you might want because that's like the chapter, like 1 chapter after she promotes, basically. So that would be nice, but she can still help in those chapters. She gets free deployment for the final chapter. Lyn does too, but Eirika I think is slightly more capable of contributing. In a fast playthrough, she probably won't be too relevant, but it's like having the mount can help out in little ways like that. So I think that's okay. I think in the end I will put her over Eliwood and Lyn, but only by a bit. I don't think she's very good. It does help, I think, that FE8 has more route maps than FE7. And in route maps, it doesn't really matter if you're not the best unit. It just matters if you can contribute a little bit. One random example I can think of is chapter 9 Eirika route. Eirika existing there lets her kill a couple pirates somewhere so that other people can go elsewhere. And it doesn't matter if she takes like 5 turns to do it, because the whole map might take 5 turns. So if you find a couple pirates at the starting point, if that means that someone like that's better at fighting, like I don't know, Joshua or Ford, if they can go elsewhere, that's still an improvement to what you would have done if you didn't use Eirika at all. So Eirika's still contributing. FE7 doesn't have a whole lot of route maps, and the ones that are there, somewhat untrained Eliwood or Lyn isn't really gonna do a whole lot anyway. But the route maps that exist, like there's not that many route maps, and the ones that exist are like Cog of Destiny or the Desert map, where you probably don't even have a room to deploy someone like Lyn or Eliwood, whereas Eirika has the forced deployment, so she's always there. Except Ephraim route, if we count Ephraim routes, then maybe Eirika goes a bit lower. I usually, for FE8 tiering, I like to take the average of their performance on Eirika and Ephraim routes, and in those, Eirika would do a bit worse, but she would still have the early game where she's relatively good. In fact, I would argue Eirika has more of a liability for most of the route split maps, not the route ones. But she doesn't really contribute all that much to what like the Seas ones, for example. So it's not a big bummer for Eirika that she misses out on the portion where she's the worst. Because when you think about it, Her best portions of the game are the early game and then the late game where she's promoted. And everything in between in Eirika route, she's not that great. Again, except for the route maps. And there are a couple of those. So, I don't know. I think like about 2 or 3 maps in Eirika route are route maps. And the other 3 are maps where she's not very good. So I guess does it even out? I don't know. But I don't think it changes her position all that much. Looking at this now, I think I kind of want to move Roy a bit lower. I do think his late game is a lot better than Eirika. But I think his early and mid-game are a bit worse. So I think it's more equivalent to Eirika than he's equivalent to Hector. So yeah, I'm going to move Roy down actually on second thought. I have the right to change my mind. I do think Roy has maybe a bit more utility than Eliwood overall. Even though Eliwood has a better endgame overall. Like a better... When he promotes relatively earlier than Roy does. And when he does, he's better at combat and general tasks. He's probably still inferior to all the other names you could deploy. Roy has a better like end game. Like when he promotes, he's better. But that period of time is so short. So, I actually don't know which one of these I like better for tiering. Ephraim is really good. I think a lot of people who like Hector also like Ephraim. Even though they're a bit different as units, I think they have a lot of similarities personality-wise. And just the fact that they use a different weapon type than swords, I think also favors them a lot in the eyes of a lot of fans. I like Ephraim a lot. My favorite way of describing his stat layout is like imagine Raven, but with better bulk and then lances. I don't think I often mention better bulk, but I think Ephraim, he's not like Hector level durable. He's not like even Seth level durable, but he's a lot more tanky than a lot of these units. Like a lot of these are like fragile sword users, and then Ephraim just comes in with like slightly above average bulk, but then his offense is just fantastic, especially against things he's effective against because the Regent Leaf is so powerful. It's stronger than the Wolf Beetle because of triple effectiveness, and then it's a lance, so it's still in a better situation than like the Rapier and even the Manikati. It's so strong. He can one-shot Armor Knights in his joining chapter, and I think he never stopped one-running. I watched a 0% growth run by Jumpy23, and he one-rounded a Knight in chapter 16 at base level. No stat boosters, no promotion, nothing. Just one-rounded a Knight there. That's impressive. Like, you will never see Eliwood do something like that unless he has, like... I don't even know how he could one-shot, like a heavy spear, maybe? Even that might be difficult. Maybe a heavy spear against the Knight would get the job done. But the point is, Regent Leaf is super, super strong. Even against most enemies, it's like it has like the weight of an Iron Lance with the strength of a Steel Lance. It's super good. Similarly to like using the Wolf Beetle against generic enemies that are not mounted or anything. That's really nice. Same promotion issue as Eirika, but when he's unpromoted, he still managed to contribute, kind of like Hector. In fact, I think he's even better than Hector in that regard because he has actual speed. He can one-shot enemy cavaliers or even one-shot them pretty easily. But even something like an enemy fighter, if he can hit them twice with the Regent Leaf and he's leveled up, they're probably dead. And that's an enemy with like weapon triangles advantage. Something like, I think he doubles mercenaries on average. That'd be a pretty hard threshold to hit. But something like, I think Gargoyles almost died to him or can die to him if he's over-leveled. I'm just trying to think of like tough enemies you could kill, because obviously you can kill like Renavents, stuff like that, that's easy. Moguls, like no problem, you can kill those. Most enemy types I think generally can die to Ephraim, especially because he's effective against the strongest enemy types. I know in draft races you use him to kill like a couple of bosses. And that's just before promoting. Like after he promotes, which yeah, it's late, but when he promotes he's still like super, super strong. His personal weapon, the Sigurd, is so powerful, you kind of wish that your Fridolfnir users could use it because it's so strong, it gets +5 might. It has, I think, like several points more might than the Fridolfnir does, and it just obliterates everything that it touches. Even bosses that aren't necessarily weak to it. Like, he does significant damage to Leon, and he's a freaking tank. So I think I had him in like B tier before. Even though he's a foot unit for most of the game, he's still pretty decent. Yeah, B tier is pretty good for him, I think. Originally I had him over below Celica, but I think I like him more than Celica overall. Even though Celica is like pretty decent, I still feel like Ephraim feels better. He might have better unit feel. That might just be why I'm putting him over, because he's so powerful. Whereas Celica, on paper, and like we can analyze her and say she's relatively better off compared to the cast, but Ephraim is just so powerful that I feel like it's fair to put him over her. But I wouldn't. I can see people arguing Celica being better than him the other way. Like I know Rengor, for example, had it the other way around. Then we get to Tellius, and we get to Ike, FE9 Ike. Ike, I have, I think, Rengor on record saying that Ike is actually just as good as Roy, which I think is really funny, but the comparison holds water in a lot of ways that I want to share with you. If I tell you that there's a Lord that's not very good in the early game and kind of throughout the mid game with a late promotion and with a sword that's sure technically effective against enemy cavaliers, but he still doesn't one-shot anything, and then but only for the last 2 chapters or so, he gets a really strong infinite use 1-2 range weapon that increases their bulk and makes him very good against the final bosses. You might think I'm describing Roy, but the application obviously applies to Ike as well. Now, you can phrase a lot of comparisons this way and do that in a disingenuous way, but I think they have a lot in common that I think is pretty funny. But I think Ike has a couple advantages over Roy. For one, he has supports that actually activate in an efficient playthrough, so if you wanted him to support Oscar, for example, and make him invincible, you could do that, and that would already add points. Like in FE9, you don't build supports by being adjacent, you build supports by being deployed on the same map. And since Ike is auto-deployed, that's just a bonus that he's always going to give to units you deploy. So he can support someone like Oscar at no opportunity cost, really. The Earth Affinity is obviously really good. It gives a lot of avoid, like 45 avoid at A, I think. It's insanely good. Does Oscar need to stay alive? Well, he needs some kind of support, I think, to benefit off of it. And, I mean, it depends. It's kind of hard for Ike to keep up sometimes. I do think Ike's combat is a bit underwhelming throughout the entire game. Even after he promotes, the lack of hand axes and like javelins really hurts trying to go through maps quickly. Sometimes I find that FE9 enemies are too bulky to one-round with 1-2 range anyway, but I think if you forge a 1-2 range weapon, you can usually one-round things. Depends on the unit we're talking about, but in an efficient context, you're probably training 1 or 2 units to be really, really good. Generally at least 1 flyer, and then like maybe a paladin of some kind, maybe using Titania. And they can probably one-round with forged 1-2 range. That's probably the kind of benchmark you want to reach for. Ike can never compare to that. He can never be one of those carries. He doesn't have to move to do it. He doesn't have to 1-2 range to do it. And you do need 1-2 range to kill at least some of the enemies. I think you might need 1 range, even on a carry unit sometimes, to kill in time. The other part of Ike, of course, that makes him hard to really carry with is the fact that he needs to seize maps sometimes. So he needs to get to the seize point, and he can't really be on the front lines because he's probably going to have to be in the saddlebags. This is a game where you get Savior at some point in the game, so that would also be a good way to combine having to carry someone around and having to actually fight. That's only applies to a couple maps, of course. Before that, you'll probably do something like carry Ike with someone else and then have a carry run ahead and fight things. That's probably the most efficient way to play a lot of FE9 siege maps. I do think it'd be fair to put Ike in C and Roy, keeping him in D, because there's still a couple maps where he's really good with the Ragnell, and there are, I think on the top of my head, it's actually, is it 1 or 2 maps? I think it's 2 maps. It's the Laguz map where you go to seize the tower, and it's the actual endgame, which is a bit more involved than Roy's endgame, I feel like. And then the maps before that, I think he's generally better than Roy anyway. Like, he promotes earlier and he can actually sort of fight a bit better. And then also his early game, I think, is just better. You have less alternative options. Like, it's mostly Titania killing things, but there are some things where I can come in handy to clean up things. And Roy has those situations as well, but they feel like you have to set him up a lot more for Roy to work out because he's more fragile. Ike, I think his durability just generally is better off compared to FE9 enemies. So I think it's okay to put Ike in C tier, but I would like some space between Hector and Ike. So hopefully there's going to be a couple other lords I can put in that segment, because I think this is the way I would put him. Then we have Radiant Dawn Ike. Bit of a history lesson. I think when FE10 was just released, the people were making tier lists based off of it. They would generally have an S tier with only Har and Ike in it. And nowadays, I think Ike is being put a bit lower because Har is just that much better. Like, the mobility that he has is unquestionable. The level lead that he has that lets him get to 3rd tier, whereas Ike is stuck in tier 2. That's a pretty big difference that makes Har significantly better. And you can argue about Soth and Jill, but I don't think that's the kind of war I want to get in. I don't want to get into exactly how good is Ike, because obviously his combat is phenomenal. He's one of the faster units on the Grow Mercenaries. He's like borderline doubling a lot of enemies when he joins, but you can pretty easily make him double through like bonus XP. He caps a couple stats early, so you can like Bex up his speed. I think he can usually cap his stats. If you transfer him from Path of Radiance, he's going to get +2 speed from that generally. That can also help. Generally, you can make Ike double the enemies that he needs to double, and his strength is humongous. He has the Etard, which you get 50 uses of it. I've never run out of uses anyway. I still make sure to pick up the 2nd Etard, and then never end up using it, because, 50 uses is way too much. And it's just a really strong, like, it's like stronger than the Silver Sword, I think. It's just super powerful. And that's really all he needs to fight until you get promoted, and then he gets the Ragnell way earlier in FE10 than he does in FE9, so for all of Part 4, which is a pretty significant portion of the game in my opinion, and then the end portion of Part 3, he has the Ragnell, which is just a super busted weapon, 1-2 range, infinite use sword that can basically just locks you out of soft locking. It's super powerful. I love to give him Paragon in part 4 when he does have the promotion finally, so he can level up really fast, take advantage of his insane growth, and increase his chances against the endgame bosses that he has to fight, of which there are a lot. He's like, honestly, I would say in endgame, Ike is better than the Laguz Royals just because of one-turn range. It doesn't matter that much if you're one-turning most of the maps, but if you're playing casually, he feels a lot more useful than Laguz Royals just because he can counter the dragons. He can fight snipers without fearing death, like Tabarn, for example. Like crossbow dudes, I guess. He doesn't really care that much about magic if you just give him pure water. He feels a lot more just applicable in general situations. As long as you make sure that he doesn't die, which is not often anyway because he's so bulky and he has ether and earth support as well, then he's usually fine. Like, he's one of the best units in 4-4 as well. He's so powerful there. In part 3, I don't think he's the best unit you have just because Har's around, but he's up there as like top 3, top 4, depending on the map. Sometimes Titania is better, especially in the late part 3 maps where you have to route and kind of move ahead of schedule. Whereas in the early part 3 maps, you can sometimes argue Ike is better because he does double more often than Titania, for example. Or sometimes there's terrain in the way, like in 3-7 and 3-4, that prevents Titania from making it all the way somewhere where you would like Ike to be. So those are like little difference between them. But the fact that he can compete with Titania at all, I think, is a sign that he's really, really powerful. I don't know if he should be up there in S tier though, because I do feel like within FE10, there's at least one unit that's like much better than him by like a tier. So if Har were on this tier list, I would put him here, which means Ike probably belongs in the A tier here. And I think he belongs at the top of it right now. I do think he's overall better than Alm. I think you could sometimes argue that it should be like this, but honestly, I'm going to put him like this. I think that makes more sense. I don't feel like arguing why Ike is worse than one version of Alm but better than the other. Even though I think one of these two is better, I think they should be next to each other. So I'm going to put Ike at the top of A tier right now, and I think at the very least most people just casually playing can relate to this placing. Again, just like with Ephraim and Celica, you can probably argue it the other way around, but I think this is the way that most people can relate to it at the very least. Then we have Micaiah, one of the few female lords actually. Come to think of it, like a lot of this is like male dominated, but we do have Micaiah. I like Micaiah for her utility, but I can't really put her very high just on the basis of her lack of bulk and her lack of speed. She's very, very vulnerable. You have to be super careful with Micaiah. She's one of the biggest threats of just giving me a game over in my Radiant Dawn Iron Man run. Thankfully it didn't happen, but there were a couple times where I think if I made like one slight error, she could have died. Obviously she has the Thani, which can one-shot enemy like knights and cavaliers sometimes. There aren't that many of them that you will probably do it on an efficient play. Generally the most efficient way to kill especially bosses, the best way to do that is usually not to put Micaiah in the range, especially because she sometimes has to seize or escape. Generally the best way to do it is like throw Soth at the problem or some kind of Laguz Royal or overpowered pre-promote that you get. Usually those are better off. People with, you know, more bulk than she does and more move than she does. She's kind of hurt by the fact that Radiant Dawn really hates mages, and so enemies have more res than they usually do in other games, and they're kind of fast, so she can't double them. She sometimes even gets doubled. Their speed caps are bad. Her magic is pretty high, but it's not enough to usually even get to one shot, let alone two shot. Vice versa, you know what I mean. One thing that is very good about Micaiah though is her healing abilities, especially after part 1 when she promotes, she gains actual staves. Sacrifice is situationally useful, but the real use comes with staff use. If you train Micaiah, her magic will be really high, and as a result she can like restore people, she can just heal them after they take a bunch of damage from an enemy Laguz, and she can often just keep herself out of danger by using a physics staff, which is very, very good. I found Micaiah's staff utility to be really good in part 3 especially. Part 4 less so, but still situationally useful, to the point where I would honestly, I have Micaiah in B tier in my preemptive list right now, which it feels weird to put her over Hector and Ike, but the fact that she's, it's weird because her late part 1, for example, is pretty trash. Like she can't do a whole lot on those maps. She can't heal people with the staffs like she can in part 3, and she's also one of many units, all of which are honestly better than her besides like Meg, Fiona, Edward. But the healing utility that she provides in late game is so good. Maybe not in part 4. In part 4 you don't need healing as much, but it's still nice to have. I wouldn't call her bad in the desert map, for example, just for like restoring people or I don't know, healing people from a distance with physics still. I do think she's definitely worse than the units in B tier right now. So like bottom of B, or maybe the top of C. I do think she's better than Pathvarian's Ike. I'm just not sure about Hector. Maybe Hector's just in the wrong place. Tier lists look weird. Cross-game tier lists always look weird. I'm gonna put her here, at the bottom of B. I do think her mid-game is really good, but it's only 3 chapters, but they're pretty important chapters to be good in. Like, imagine not having Micaiah and Laura for part 3. Like, sure, she shares that utility with Laura, but I think her magic is better. But like, imagine Nolan or like Voluk or who else? Jill having to spend their turn healing instead of being able to just attack or use the Goose Grass or anything like that. Just because Micaiah's there, that's such huge utility that I really like. It also kind of sucks in 313 that she can't cross the line and she has to like heal people from a distance only. That is kind of unfortunate. Maybe she should be in C tier. Yeah, maybe she should be like between these. I do think she's better than Pathvarian's Ike. Maybe this. I think this feels slightly better. I think this feels more natural than it. I had her at bottom of B, but I do feel like Hector is a little bit better. Weird. This is going to end up very different from my usual list, but I think I like it better this way. Then we have some more Marth. I'm not going to try to repeat myself on Marth too much, but a couple differences from his original self in FE3 as well. Shadow Dragon adds reclassing, and Marth cannot reclass, but everyone else can, so relatively speaking, he is a lot worse off in that regard. He has a lot of issues just keeping up with the enemy stats in Hard 5, which is what I'm basing this rating on, the hardest rating. Marth usually gets 2-shot, not 1-rated as much as long as he's leveled up, but like I said before, Marth is kind of forced to trek from village to village all over the place, and it makes it literally hard to feed kills to him without slowing down the process of getting to the villages and then getting to the thrones or to the gates. So I think that makes Marth hard to raise, suboptimal to raise, kind of like the reverse problem of what made Seliph and FE1 Marth so good. Kind of makes Marth bad, which is weird because they have similar things going on, but still if you actually want to train him to make him do all that, and the same goes for FE1 Marth. The other thing about FE11 Hard 5 is the enemies are just too strong for even a trained Marth to get to a throne and seize it quickly, whereas FE1 Marth has to deal with like weaker enemies and FE3 Marth as well. He can reasonably be trained to a point where he can do that, but in FE11 you really need someone else to carry like the torch for you. You kind of need to clear out maps or at least like carve your path through the whole thing. You can't just warp skip him. And if you're warp skipping, that's the other thing. FE11 gives you enough warp to, well, FE1 does it too, but FE11 gives you enough warp to often clear the boss out and then warp Marth to the point and seize. And in those kind of scenarios, Marth only seizes, he doesn't do any combat, and he actually doesn't get any XP from the whole thing, whereas the boss killer probably will. Marth isn't good enough to kill the bosses, let alone survive the boss areas most of the time. And Sita usually isn't bulky enough to survive either, but she can swoop in and get the kill either through her flying or through another warp, and then Marth can come in and get the seize. And that makes skipping with Marth not very good for Marth. Like, it doesn't really make him very good. So I would honestly, I have him in C in my list right now, but honestly I put him in D tier because I don't think he's very good. The one cool thing about FE11 Marth that I want to mention before I just shove him off in a bad tier is he does open up a funny avenue of play where you kill most of your units that are not Marth, level him up and maybe like one other person like Sita, maybe keep Jigen alive. This will raise the average level of your party, which sounds like a very stupid thing to do, but what that does is it opens up the option of using generics, which when they join you, if you have less units alive than the deployment limit, the game will supplement that with generics that will get the average level of your current party, and they will count Marth. And so the higher level your Marth is, the higher level that party will be, the generic party will be. So you can like promoted enemies or promoted generics in chapter 5, and generics have generic bases and growth, which are not good, but the promoted classes have much higher bases than most units would. So imagine if you can choose between an actual generic general, for example, and, I don't know, Cord, or even Barst, honestly. The general will be much better. So in that fashion, if you train Marth to kill everyone else off, you will have better units that way. It doesn't apply to like efficient play at all, but you can do it. You can do that kind of Excel Emblem strat and make a really funny high-level generic army. I wouldn't recommend it for an efficient playthrough, obviously, but it is something funny you can do. That's all I can think of, though, so I'm going to put Marth. I think I'd honestly put him below Roy and Eliwood, because I don't think there's real potential for him. I could put him above Lyn. The Rapier, you might think that like this is kind of unfair to Marth, because there's the option of the Forged Rapier, which I suppose is something we should examine. FE11 is dominated by forged effective weapons, and the Rapier is one of those, so why not count it in favor of Marth? The reason for that is it's just so much less efficient to forge the rapier than it is to forge the wing spear, for example. And I know not being the best option doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad option overall, but it's also a really expensive option, and it takes like a lot of more investment to make it one-shot enemies. And if you don't one-shot enemies with your forge, there's kind of no point to it, because one of the whole reasons to do it that's worth the expense is you get twice as many uses out of it, because if you're one-shotting versus two-shotting with a forged weapon, you only have to hit the enemy once. And so even if you have to chip every enemy that you hit with the rapier, it's still so inconvenient to use. It's so bad. It can work out, you can definitely still beat the game while doing it, but it's not an efficient option. But because it's available technically as something you can do that might help a little bit, I'm okay with putting Marth like a little bit higher, like below Eirika maybe. That's about all the credit I wanted to give it to, because it is not an efficient route, and I said this would be an efficient context. Just closing my email application there. So yeah, I'm gonna put Marth there. Next up we have FE12 Marth. Kind of similar to him. Same problems as Marth before, like he has to go through the villages and everything. FE12 Marth is a lot more competent at base. They start him at like level 4 instead of level 1, with somewhat appropriate bases. And when he joins in Prologue 8, he's actually pretty useful for fighting the enemies there. Depends on difficulty, how good he really is, but he can definitely at least survive a hit and fight him off. I think someone like Ogmar or Athena, depending on the difficulty, might have some better performances, like especially in the doubling front. I don't think he doubles anything. I don't think he gets doubled by thieves though, which is nice, but he can't double like the barbarians in Prologue 8. I think that kind of reflects how good he is for a lot of the game. Like doesn't double, but doesn't get doubled all that much either. Generally, you kind of shape the way you play a chapter around moving Marth around in an efficient playthrough, either through like movement stabs like rescue and warp, depending on difficulty again, or just keeping him safe while he walks to a village, to a recruitable character, and then to the gate at last. So you make sure Marth is safe as he does it, and hopefully gets levels along the way, because in FE12, even though you might not want to, you still want to invest into Marth, or you still have to invest into Marth for the final boss kill, for the Thalkion kill, or you forge like a super strong Thoron to kill him with. One of those two things is probably true for an efficient playthrough. I think also another way to do it is like triangle attack with Pala. I've seen a couple funny endgame kills. Medius is probably not... You probably don't need to train Marth for that, actually. I think it's actually mostly more casual playthroughs where you've trained Marth for the Thalkion kill. So maybe he's not that required for it. But for some strategies, it can be nice for your Marth to be good. Because if your Marth doesn't survive anything at all, you can't have enemies in his way at all. But if you have one enemy that attacks him and he survives, it opens up new strategies where you can, for example, make a wall next to Marth so that only one enemy can reach him. And that way, that opens up a couple pathways. I don't know, I think Marth in FE12 is just better off. But it's hard to justify him exactly like where he goes. I don't remember where Donna put him in my FE12 review tier list. I think it was like, he ended up in like B tier somewhere. I have him in A tier in my preliminative list, but I kind of want to put him a little bit lower than that. He's fine, obviously, but it's hard to really praise Marth in another game where you can't reclass and have like any other options besides like running from village to village. And again, do you want to give him credit for recruiting characters and getting those villages? I'm also not decided on that. I would definitely want to put him below Ephraim. I'm not sure about Celica, so I think B tier is honestly fine for him. We'll throw him here for now. FE12 is not the game I'm the most versed in, as you can probably tell, so we'll throw him here for now. Next up is Awakening Chrom. Again, I didn't include Robin. If I did include Robin, they'd have an own S tier for themselves, just in case you wanted to know. But I didn't want to include avatars unless I could help it, and like with Corrin. But Chrom is pretty cool. I thought it was alright in Awakening. I only played hard mode recently. I've played some Lunatic, where I found it pretty hard to actually train Chrom up. Like, it's hard to justify doing it when Robin exists. And training more than one unit in Awakening is generally a recipe for making things harder on yourself. You could try to beat the game with Chrom instead of Robin. Obviously, that's the inferior option, but that's like the only one I can see. But it's kind of harder to snowball him because he doesn't have Veteran or one to range accessible, so that makes it a lot harder to get free chip on enemies, for example, to like 1v1 them with. He does have the Rapier. I think it takes a little bit before you can forge it, and even if you do forge it, it only lasts for so long. I don't know if forging Rapiers is really the way to go with him if you're trying to use him. He has the Thalkion from the start, which I thought was funny when I first saw it, but it's like a 5 might Thalkion, so it's kind of like a... I think it's better than the bronze, but worse than an iron sword. It's like an anti-self-lock weapon, I think. It doesn't do a whole lot, except against wyverns. It's pretty good against wyverns. It's kind of nice to have a triple effective basically a free Worm Slayer that you have. Worm Slayer is a bit stronger, but you get the point. It's nice in Chapter 5. And I always thought he was decent, not like excellent or anything, but the fact that he has like a Paladin promotion as axes is pretty cool. I need some other options that I kind of like, but not the Lord I'm most familiar with. He's nice. Generally, the way I use Chrom is put him as a backpack for Robin and just kind of have him get protected by Robin, so he's more of a liability that way. He does get level ups and eventually he gets promotion at that point, but that's like all I really do with him. I would say, where did I have him originally? I originally have him over Celica, which I guess is okay. I kind of want to put him below now. I kind of like Celica a bit more than Chrom. I do think he's better than Marth. The Cavalry promotion especially I kind of like. But that's really all I can say about Chrom. And I'm not super familiar with how good he is, but some of you Awakening experts can probably chime in. I think Chrom is good. He has good growth and good bases, obviously, but almost everyone in Awakening does, so that's not much of a selling point within that game. But he works out nicely. One funny thing about what I mentioned about Chrom, before I forget, is that he's in a game with a pair-up system, and usually Lords, they kind of get fucked over by the fact that they only have one deployment slot they can go in. They can't be moved around, where other people can. But with the pair-up system, it doesn't really matter that much. You can just pair them to someone else and then move wherever they want. So I think that's kind of a funny fix that also applies to Corrin. But if I say only that about Corrin, I'd be really selling her short. I don't think I've given Corrin enough praise. I've used Corrin in her base class generally. I'm going to refer to her as a girl because I've always played Corrin as a girl. But I know mill Corrin exists. I like Corrin a lot as a unit now because we're like currently in my Lunatic playthrough with Gwimbridge, we're late in the game and Corrin, I think we can safely say is our best unit. Camilla has some really good moments as well. Camilla's a lot faster. Xander's also really good, but Corrin is super bulky. Right now she is Malignite because of the Wyvern talent, and she has access to all sorts of tomes, especially the Horse Spirit is super good. She got a lot of resources like a pair of boots and a couple of defensive stat boosters, but she was already going to be the bulkiest unit even without them. But with them, she is one hell of a carry. Before I replayed Awakening Lunatic, I thought this was a game where you really had to use a lot of different units and, you know, play the game fair and square. Like, you can't low man this. Corrin and Camilla, and to a lesser extent Xander, have shown me that yes, you can still hard focus your resources into a couple units and just completely trash on the game and just completely beat all the enemies that are made to go against this strategy, like the debuffing that the game does, all the different Dragon Vein mechanics, all the enemy types that hit so hard you can't do this. You can still stack enough stats to overcome this whole problem. In Corrin's case, we stack the bulk, sometimes we stack offense, but the thing is, between like the mess hall and tonics and stat boosters and pair-ups and like certain skills, you can make them so strong. Like for Jacob, for example, we have like a damage stack, like an offensive damage stack to make him like one-shot things. In Corrin's case, it's more defensive stacks. And those all work really well to beat even the most strongest enemies into submission. Like there was like bow enemies that you would survive as a Malignite. It was super crazy how strong she is. He's insanely good. I think one of the reasons why I didn't really see this so much is I wasn't very well versed into Awakening's class and skill system. And I did like familiarize myself a bit more with the different options that you have in that game. Now, and I'm seeing, wow, even in Fates, the game where I thought class diversity was like at an all-time high, they still gave all the best skills to the Cavalier and Wyvern lines, which is not coincidentally the lines that we have Jacob dip into, and also we have Corrin had dip into. Corrin went Wyvern first, and then we're doing Cavalier line later in the game. And God, it's gonna be so overpowered to get like elbow room and a defender on her. And in Jacob's case, we got like trample as well, which is so strong. I don't know when Corrin's gonna get trample. It's gonna take a while. I think she's not quite level 15 yet, but she's really high, I think. She might go Paladin first before going back to Wyvern to Malignite. Actually, no, she's not even gonna go back to Malignite. I think we're gonna get we're gonna go Great Knight in the end. I think was the plan, to get a quick kill on a final boss. I'm diverging a bit, but that's basically like the kind of things you can do with Corrin are insane. Really rewards knowledge of the game. Even if you don't know like all that stuff, I still think Corrin is one of the better units, but I think I underestimate just how good she is. I kind of want to just put her over to Marth, honestly. I think she's that good. Honestly, one of the best units I've ever used. If I remade my top 15 units of all time, I think Corrin would be in it. Maybe along with Camilla as well. But back when I made that list, I didn't really know Corrin very well. Or Fates, for that matter. Last, I have the Three Houses Lords. I'm basing most of my opinion on this, on my discussions on this subject with Rengor, who is really good at 3 houses. I made a whole video with him, a whole video series, I should say, about tiering 3 houses, and we discuss Eliwood versus Dimitri, especially in that video, and also Claude as well. So I recommend you give that a look for another deep analysis in the context of 3 houses. This is just in the context of the lords. Obviously, all of them are really good, and they're all going to end up really high, and the only question is exactly how high they're going to go. I like to think of Eliwood as like the best player phase unit in the game, and Dimitri is the best enemy phase unit, but they have pros and cons beyond that. So Eliwood is really nice because, honestly, for all these, the thing that makes them really nice, I think, in 3 houses Maddening, which is, again, what this is based on. What makes them really nice is high base stats, especially when it comes to like strength for these 2. Enough bulk to survive at least 1 enemy, and sometimes even 2 as you go on. Good personal weapons in part 2, especially for Eliwood and to a lesser extent Claude and to a lesser extent Dimitri. Not really personal weapons, but they get the best use out of them. Again, especially Eliwood. For Eliwood, what's really cool, the little trick that Rengor taught me that I think is really cool, is she has an armor boon, and so she can get weight -5 very early on, and as a result she'll lose less speed from weapons than other people do. While they are still losing speed from everything, she's not. She actually ends up like one of the fastest units you have, which is kind of comedic. She like doubles enemies, which is not something you would expect, you know, Eliwood, like a canonically armored unit, to do, but there you have it. Actually really fast, but still really bulky. They all have really good charms, so that's very helpful when you're trying to hit gambits on enemies. Eliwood is helped by Dorothea being in-house, so you can like rally charm to get like, I think 100% hit gambits, which is kind of funny. But being able to equip like the Blaze Battalion very early on, the only C-rank battalion you get until the marketplace opens up further, lets her stun a bunch of enemies at least once per map and have like really good battalion bonuses as well. That's really nice. With Eliwood, of course, the thing we have to mention about her is the option to use the Amir and Raging Storm to just hit multiple times. If you're trying to clear maps fast in part 2, like pretty much all of them are kill boss, so the Amir is just the best weapon ever, just having a free guild force to just repeatedly attack the same enemy or bounce across the map by like killing a certain enemy. You don't even have to hit your Raging Storm. Raging Storm is also just super strong. It's like plus 18 might or something ridiculous like that, on top of her ridiculous attack. All the lords here have access to the Wyvern Rider and Wyvern Lord classes if they want it. For Dimitri, Wyvern Lord can be a bit hard to reach, but Wyvern Rider is definitely doable. And these other 2, they can definitely get Wyvern Lord if they want to. Claude also has his personal Wyvern, but Eliwood definitely just great in Wyvern Lord, which is the best class in the game. Like, we can argue how boring it is to use Wyvern Lord on everyone, but the point is, here, we're talking about optimal plays, and the optimal play here is Wyvern Lord Eliwood. I would maybe not put her in S tier. I'm trying to like overthinking it. My original list had her in A, and I think in the context of 3 houses, at the very least, Eliwood is an S tier unit. Because who's really better than Eliwood in that game? Maybe Byleth, but even that I think is like questionable, maybe? Like female Byleth and Eliwood is one of them really much better than the other, to the point where they're different tiers. I'm not even sure if like Byleth is better than Eliwood at all, thinking about it. She's really good though. Male Byleth definitely worse than Eliwood. I think I'm gonna put her in S tier in the end. I think she's really that good. Raging Storm is just that ridiculous, and even in part 1, I can't really think of a character that's better than her for the most part. Yeah, I'm gonna put Eliwood in S tier, I think. I think still below Corrin, but above the Marth, I think is where she'll go. Because she's just that good. Dimitri's more of an enemy phase unit because of the Battalion Wrath Battalion Vantage combo, which is absolutely busted for route maps. If you're not playing Paralogs, that doesn't really matter all that much because there's not that many route maps in the game in the first place. Especially part 2 is mostly kill boss, and in those cases, Battalion Wrath has its uses, but obviously not as useful as something like Raging Storm is. Dimitri also has a couple of other random problems, like an Axe Bane makes it a bit harder to get into higher Wyvern classes. A couple of other random disadvantages that he has compared to Eliwood, so I do think he's worse than Eliwood. If you're playing Paralogs, then I think he's still the best unit in the Blue Lions campaign overall. Like, again, who is better than him? Maybe Byleth, that's about it. I do think he has an issue, like, you can't tutor him for, I think, like 4 chapters in part 2, so that kind of hurts his benchmark reaching a little bit. But he can still level up normally and do a bunch of stuff, even when he's, like, angsty. So, still fine, still a really good unit, still very powerful. Like, some of the best that lay out early on, also helped by the fact that early on in Blue Lions route, you have access to, like, a bunch of other powerful units as well, and that's Rally, so that can make Dimitri look impressive, considering he still stands out in an army with the Dew in it, and Felix as well. He's really good. I like him a lot. Obviously, exclusive only one route, but the same goes for Eliwood, so like whatever, I don't really care about that. I guess if we're ranking Eliwood by the fact that Silver Snow exists, should be a bit lower, but I'm gonna assume that's not the case here. Silver Snow with Eliwood, I would probably put her in like C tier, D tier, because, you know, only available for half the game. But this is, just think of this as like Crimson Flower Eliwood. We'll put Dimitri like below Eliwood, like right below Eliwood, I think. He's very powerful. And then finally we have Claude. Claude is more of a sneaky guy, both in the story and in gameplay. He just fights as an archer. He does have such a good bow rank that he'll learn close counter soon enough, and then he'll be able to counter enemies at one range. And he can also use the mini bow, so he doesn't have the drawback that a lot of other bow users would have along the series. I think he's the only bow lord that we have all the way on here, unless you count Alm. But he's not really hurt by it. Bows are pretty good in the 3 houses. He's fine in that regard. He gets pass from his personal skill after the time skip, which is pretty cool. He has good charm, like I already said. He has a personal wyvern class that's really cool. It lets him skip maps a little bit, like in Hunting with Daybreak. There's some cool skips you can do with Claude that the other lords don't really, they need like someone else to do the skips for him. Like Dimitri needs Byleth's help because he's in the dumb class. Eirika doesn't have Hunting by Daybreak, but like Seliph, I think you can use Seliph for the clear instead of Byleth. Yeah, you can do that. But Claude kind of does it on his own, which is pretty cool. Brave Bow, pretty good weapon. He does have, I think he's not as bulky early on as the other lords are, so it's a bit harder to tank enemies with him as it is with the others. I think he still goes in S tier, but maybe like below the Marth. I think that's kind of where he ends up. Maybe more of an A tier unit. I know Rengar initially had him over Dimitri. I'm not sure about Eliwood, but I think he had him over Dimitri, which I'm not sure I understand anymore, but I forgot to ask him. But I think I'm going to rank Claude in the S tier, but like below the Marth. I think that's sensible. I like Claude a lot. I did Golden Deer first. I think he's like good, but I don't think he's like broken like these guys. So I could honestly see him at the top of A tier, perhaps even below Ike, but kind of in two minds about that. But yeah, that was the lords. That's all the lords ranked in like pretty much the entire franchise. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you enjoyed this this series. If there's a really good archetype that I somehow forgot, I'm perfectly willing to do it. But I think this might be the last hurrah for the archetype tier lists. They've been really fun to make, and I hope you guys enjoyed them as well. Even if you're just listening in the background or if you're watching them intently all the way through. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around. Peace.